Hi, and welcome to the NASCAR Hall of Fame podcast. I'm Tom Jensen, Curatorial Affairs Manager here at the Hall, and I'm here with my cohort and guest.
I'm Curator Simone, and today we're going to be talking about Richard Childress Racing and the 50th year anniversary here at the NASCAR Hall of Fame as part of the NASCAR Hall of Fame podcast series. This is episode 2, Building a Dynasty.
Richard Childress got started racing at Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem, where he was born. And he started racing in $99 claiming races, where the guy wins the car, you could buy his car for $99. What was the atmosphere like at Bowman Gray back in the late 60s?
You can only imagine. Bowman Gray remains one of the most exciting tracks in the country. One can only imagine what it was like racing in the mid to late 60s, where Richard Childress was cutting his teeth in racing and just getting started. He was racing primarily at Bowman Gray during that period of time, but in 1969, he decided to make an important decision and take a trip down to Daytona Beach.
Now, 69 was a big year. It was the year of Woodstock. It was the year of the moon landing. There were a lot of things going on politically. For Richard Childress, he was 23 years old, and he bought a Camaro, used Camaro for $400 and turned it into a race car in the Grand American Series. And he went to his boss at Douglas Battery, Mr. Douglas, the owner, and he said, "Mr. Douglas, I got this dream. I want to go race at Daytona. I need 2 weeks off so I can haul my Camaro down to Daytona and race." And Mr. Douglas told him, "Sorry, son, I need you here." So Richard made a bold gamble. He quit his job and said, "To heck with it, I'm going down to Daytona."
And his Camaro was eligible to race in the Grand American Series. And the Grand American Series at that time, it was a short-lived division in NASCAR, but it was an important and popular division in the sport's history. It featured Detroit's pony cars, so there were Camaros, Mustangs, Cougars, and AMC Javelins that battled on track. Tiny Lund and Buck Baker were two of the big names in that series during that time. Richard Childress, he brought his car down to Daytona Beach and competed in the Grand American Series road race at the Daytona International Speedway.
That was called the Citrus 250, and that featured some really great road racers, guys like Peter Gregg and Bob Tullius. Parnelli Jones was in it, and Childress in his $400 Camaro that he built into a race car himself. He qualified 8th and finished 13th in the race. And, you know, we think of these team owners with their million-dollar motorhomes. He slept in a pup tent at KOA campgrounds in Daytona while he was down there, but it was there at that moment he said, "This is what I want to do with my life. This is who I want to be. I want to race in NASCAR."
And an incredible achievement, too. Think about Richard Childress racing at a bull ring, essentially, at Bowman Gray. And here he is at Daytona racing on the road course and turning right and faring quite well when you look at his finish in that event.
Yeah, he finished in the upper half of the event, which for a guy making his first start in that series against a lot of guys who had much more experience was pretty amazing. But 69 was memorable because Childress also got his big break later in the year at a place called Alabama International Motor Speedway, what we know today as Talladega Super Speedway. What happened down there?
Well, there are 2 big days of racing planned in September of 1969. It was the debut of Talladega Super Speedway, and on Sunday was the Cup race, but on Saturday there was a Grand American event that was scheduled, and that was Childress's intention, to compete in the Grand American race.
He ran in the Grand American race. He did okay, not great, but he did okay. But there was a big controversy. This was the first race. Talladega was Big Bill France's dream track that he built to be bigger and faster than Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But when they got there, the guys in the Grand National Series, the Richard Pettys and the David Pearsons, they were running 200 miles an hour at Talladega in 1969 on bias ply tires with no soft walls, no Hans devices. And so they walked out over safety, a lot of them.
Uncharted territory. Stock cars never raced at speeds that high or at bankings that were that steep. And so many of the drivers simply did not want to take the risk, and they refused to compete on Sunday. And with that created a brand new opportunity for Richard Childress.
So on Saturday, after the Grand Am race, Bill France went to the Grand Am drivers and said, "We're going to have a race on Sunday, no matter how many people are here. But if you stay, I will make it worth your while to be here." So they lined up for the inaugural Talladega 500. They lined up the Grand National guys who stayed at the front of the field based on qualifying, and the back half of the field was the Grand Am drivers based on where they finished in the Grand Am race.
That's right. Richard Childress competed in that event, as did a lot of other Grand American drivers and also some of the independents that chose to not boycott. Bill France Sr. was extremely grateful to Richard Childress and the others that did decide to compete on Sunday and put on a show for those fans that believed they were going to and did wind up attending the first NASCAR Premier Series race at Talladega.
Now, Richard Brickhouse won that race. Just kind of a couple quick little asides. 1969, the Daytona 500 was won by a Ford Torino Talladega, and the Talladega 500 was won by a Dodge Daytona. That's kind of an aside, but Childress finished 23rd in the first race in the Grand National Series at Talladega. And he said he left there with $5,000 in cash that Bill France paid him. And he said that was more money than he's ever seen in his life, and he was convinced he'd never have to work another day in his life.
And that really set the stage for Richard Childress Racing. With that money, Richard Childress was able to go back to North Carolina and build his first race shop, and he began competing more regularly on the Grand American circuit, and also eventually began competing in a limited number of NASCAR Premier Series races.
Now, one of the fun things about putting together an exhibit, any exhibit, is it's kind of a continuing education project. You learn stuff you didn't know. And when Richard Childress went to Daytona in February of '69, he had that '68 Camaro that was blue and white and had the number 41. When he went to Talladega, he still had the '68 Camaro, but it was green and it was number 13. And I didn't really understand why. So when he was here for the exhibit opening, I said, Richard, why did you have a blue and white 41 and then it became a green number 13? He said, my racing luck was so bad in the first half of 1969 that I thought it couldn't get any worse if I changed my number to 13, which was unlucky, and painted it green, which is an unlucky color in racing. And the irony is, he had the best luck of all at Talladega because he left with enough money to start his team.
And it's one of really so many great stories that we learned and that Richard Childress shared with us while we were putting together the RCR Only in America exhibit.
Now, when you look at Richard Childress's career and you think he won the 6 championships with Earnhardt and truck championships and Xfinity championships and all that, and he's got a big team with hundreds of people. It didn't start out that way. It took him from 1969 to 1981 when he drove. He never won a race. He was part of a group they called Independents. What were the Independents? Can you define them for us?
Back in the 1970s, and even before the 1970s, there were a group of drivers who essentially raced on a shoestring, and we hear that phrase all the time still, where they had limited, if any, sponsorship money, and small crews, most of which were volunteer, and competed as many races as they possibly could. And they would travel throughout the country, compete in the Cup Series, and try to preserve their equipment, which in many cases prevented them from perhaps running as hard as they might like to, because they wanted to ensure that it had a car available for the following race. And there were some big names in the 1970s in the group of independents, such as James Hilton, Cecil Gordon, Elmo Langley, and Richard Childress was one of those independents. Although wins were rare, the independents were extremely talented drivers, and they also were excellent mechanics, and they often ran in the top 5 and in the top 10.
Childress told me he built his own engines, he painted his own cars, he welded his own cars. Sometimes he'd work 17, 18 hours a day just to keep going. And that's how challenging it was. These guys didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of resources. Even though he was enjoying some success, he decided in 1981 to step away from the cockpit. And that was inspired by 2 things. Number one, he could see the sport changing. The Winston money had been coming in steadily, and the quality of the tracks was being upgraded. The sponsors were being upgraded. There was more money flowing into the sport. There was better television flowing into the sport. And Junior Johnson came up to him and said, Richard, here's the thing. There's a lot of great drivers in this sport. There aren't a lot of great owners. You'd make a great owner.
And Richard Childress was developing those ownership skills and those business skills throughout the 1970s. So he was racing hard, he was building cars, but he was also out there hustling, trying to gather sponsorship money to compete. And in the late 70s and into the 1980 season, Richard Childress had some success on the track. And with his volunteer crew, including he had a doctor on his crew, he had an attorney on his crew, and he fared well all different types of tracks. He even finished in the top 10 7 times at Riverside out in California. But there were big changes in the sport in 1981, as Tom mentioned. Another important change was after the Riverside season opener, NASCAR mandated that teams needed to switch to the smaller Detroit production models. So as a result, all the teams had to switch cars, and they were used to running cars in the late 70s, where not only were there a lot of cars available, but a lot of those components were available as well. So Richard Childress and the independents essentially had to start all over with the Daytona 500 in 1981. At that point, the writing was really on the wall that he could either start over and begin racing with the smaller cars and begin trying to acquire components, or, as Tom mentioned and as Junior Johnson recommended, perhaps consider quitting driving and fully pursue ownership.
And a unique opportunity presented itself in 1981. Dale Earnhardt won the championship in his second full season in 1980, driving for Rod Osterland. And Osterland sold the team midway through the season to Jim Stacy, better known as J.D. Stacy, who turned out to be a very controversial figure in NASCAR. And he and Earnhardt quickly fell out of favor with each other. And so Earnhardt quit, despite the fact that he was the reigning champion. He quit mid-season. And he and Childress had been buddies. They were from similar backgrounds, two blue-collar guys who enjoyed hunting and fishing and who raced hard and who didn't start out with a lot. Both came from humble beginnings. And so he moved to RCR and was the first outside driver Richard Childress had. And he only drove the last 11 races of the 81 season. Why didn't he stay beyond that?
There was a conversation that Richard Childress and Dale Earnhardt shared at the conclusion of the 1981 season. They bonded. They formed a close friendship, and they had known each other, of course, before 1981. Childress was honest with Earnhardt and mentioned that at this point in time, I still do not have the resources that I think you need and that you deserve in order to pursue your second championship. And Dale Earnhardt appreciated Richard Childress' honesty, and he went and raced for Bud Moore for the following 2 seasons. But as we can see, and there were so many amazing stories with Richard Childress racing and his history, that timing really is everything. And Earnhardt came at the right time and found success with Richard Childress, but as it turned out, it also created opportunity for a driver known as Ricky Rudd.
Now, what was Rudd's background?
Ricky Rudd ran very competitively in the late 1970s. He amassed a lot of top 5s and top 10 finishes, but had not entered victory lane. And that would change once he began racing for Richard Childress.
What's amazing to me is Ricky Rudd scored his first victory as a driver in the first for RCR on the road course at Riverside in 1983. Richard Childress Racing didn't win a race until the 243rd race of Childress's career. That's the equivalent of almost 7 full seasons now. I mean, he busted his hump for not a lot of reward and not a lot. And imagine the persistence it takes to go 243 races dating back to 1969, and you finally win your first race 14 years later.
Yeah, and it must have been just an absolutely incredible moment for Richard Childress and his family and his team, and also for Ricky Rudd. As we worked on and did research for this exhibit, it was really fun to find just how many stories were connected. And take Ricky Rudd, for example. He wins in 1983 twice. He actually takes another victory later on that season.
Martinsville,
and winds up kicking off a 16-year consecutive winning streak for Ricky Rudd, which also ended after a win at Martinsville in the late 1990s.
Yep. And just to throw in a quick plug for the hall here, we've got Ricky Rudd's Riverside winning car and Riverside trophy in the RCR 50 Only in America exhibit. So Rudd stays with him for a couple of years, and then Earnhardt returns. The plan all along was for Earnhardt to come back. And he comes back in 1984, and they don't win the first year, but they have success the first year. They win in 85, and then in 86, they win the first of their 6 championships together. Now remember, Earnhardt has 7. He won 1 in 1980, driving for Osterland. But once they started winning, it was game on.
They were tough. during that span from 1986 through 1994. 6 championships together with Dale Earnhardt and 53 wins during that span. And when you look at some of the other successful Hall of Fame drivers during that stretch, Rusty Wallace had 1 championship. Bill Elliott had 1 championship. And Darrell Waltrip at that point did not win any more championships. So it was really, they were just hooked up during that period of time. And also the famous black number 3 made its first appearance in the late 1980s.
Right, 1988 was the first year for the Goodwrench sponsorship. And on display here, we actually have a 1987 championship car that originally ran in the blue and yellow Wrangler colors, but it also raced in 88, so it's the black Goodwrench livery. And interestingly enough, that was the last car that Dale Earnhardt won a race on bias ply tires before they switched over to the radial tires. When we did this exhibit, Richard was adamant that he didn't want the exhibit to be about him. It was about the people who made this team. In addition to Earnhardt, there were the flying aces. Tell us a little bit about some of the crew chiefs back then.
Kirk Schemmerdine also wound up making a major contribution to Richard Childress Racing. He came from Philadelphia originally and was a crew chief for James Hilton, who was one of the independent drivers in the 1970s. Richard Childress presented him with an opportunity. And so Schemmerdine and Childress essentially in the early to mid 1980s worked together to help develop and build up RCR from being a team that was consistently a top 10 and top 5 threat to becoming a championship team. And then there was another very successful crew chief with RCR in the early 1990s after Kirk Schemmerdine moved on. Andy Petrie moved on, was brought on board at Richard Childress Racing, and he also helped fuel a great deal of Earnhardt and Childress' success from 93 through the mid-90s.
There are so many memorable wins for Earnhardt. There was his last victory at Talladega in October 2000 when he came from 17th to win with 4 laps to go. There was the famous battles with Terry Labonte at Bristol where he spun Labonte out late in the race. But the most iconic win of all and the most emotional win certainly had to be the 1998 Daytona 500. As Childress said, they won the Daytona 499 plenty of times, but they finally won the 598.
And what makes it even more amazing, not just Earnhardt finally finding victory lane after so many years, but look at Richard Childress. He made his first appearance at Daytona in 1969, and here in 1998 he enters victory lane. Unfortunately,
we close this segment with one of the saddest days in NASCAR history. February 18th, 2001, Earnhardt is in a story you couldn't make up. 2 cars Dale Earnhardt owns finish 1-2 in the Daytona 500. Michael Waltrip wins, breaking it 0 for 467 streak. Dale's son, Dale Jr., finished second. They're both in Dale Earnhardt Inc. cars, and Dale's running third in his Richard Childress Racing black number 3, and he crashes on the last lap. He's killed. And that was the unfortunate end to the Earnhardt era. But his legacy lives on, and he certainly holds a permanent place in the Richard Childress Racing history in the hearts of millions of race fans everywhere.
That's right. And Richard Childress Racing would press on. And in the next episode of our podcast series, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the on-track success that Richard Childress Racing had pressing on into the new millennium.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm Tom Jensen.
And I'm Dan Simone. Thank you very much.
We'll see you next week.